Nowhere Video Network.
Portland, Oregon, also known as the Rose City, a thriving population along the banks of the Willamette River. Born from a forest clearing in 1851 at the pinnacle of the Victorian era, Oregonians and Portlanders alike are proud of their heritage and their ties that brought their ancestors westward over 150 years ago. But there is another piece to Portland's past, one you will not find in the history books or among the treasured relics of the local historical society. A past denied, hidden in shame, and quietly buried for the last 7 decades. One man has dedicated a generous portion of his life to uncovering the truth. Founder of Cascade Geographic Society and curator of the Portland Underground, Michael P. Jones.
If you really want to know about the history of Portland, you have to go underground.
Every opportunity to block, to tear down, to erase, to hide, they did. Nobody else was down here. Nobody else was crazy enough. The saloons were set up to get everyone smashed. That means the victims and the witnesses. The victims got drunk and the witnesses got drunk, so nobody saw when they fell through that floor. They had to be knocked out for 13 to 16 hours. This whole story about Shanghai and the tunnels, the underground, the vice, the corruption, this really made it human, and it changed my perspective. This was a story that you couldn't hide. This was a story that needed to be told.
My first experience in the underground. I'm 7 years old. Anytime I hear somebody mention a sea captain, I think of him. Carved pipe and this beautiful cane, and if his face looked like it had been chiseled by the salt of the sea. And he starts talking about Shanghai, and I wasn't buying the thing he was doing. So he stood up and he said, "Follow me if you don't believe me." So we left the hotel. Now I'm 7 years old. I'm leaving the hotel with a stranger. We went into this building that's half gone, and he pulls up this trapdoor. And then down we go. And when we got to the bottom, he took his cane and he pointed at what I thought was a steel door. And he opened that door, and he handed me a little box of wooden matches. And he says, "You take these matches, and you go through that door, and don't make any turns." So I took that box of matches, and I lit my first match, and a whole new world opened up. It was a world of stone and brick, beautiful architecture, but also a world of darkness. And I started in through this tunnel. Match went out, so somehow I was able to light the second match. And he's talking to me as I'm going in, so I feel like I'm not alone. So the second match goes out. I was able to light the third one, so I'm walking and he's still talking to me, and then all of a sudden he just stops and he goes, "Well, see you later, kid." And he turns to walk away, lets the door slam shut. The match goes out, I scream, I go running through that tunnel, busting through that door, and about knocked him over. Now, when I got back to the hotel, Dewey was there, and he was going crazy. He was so mad. I still remember it like it was yesterday. But finally, he listened to me, and he realized I had discovered something. And I was so intrigued about the underground that he stopped being mad and made me a deal. He said, "If you never leave the hotel, ever, except with me, I'll get you into other segments." And so what he would do, he would switch hotel rooms every week. you'd get into one and then another, because back in those days, the underground connected. So that was my first experience at 7 years old. And my entire life, at different intervals, I was drawn back to the underground and saw what the underground was really made of. And really have learned to appreciate it, because it's a dark history of Portland. It is not the kind of history that the City of Fathers talk about. It's a history that really begins in 1850. Portland called it Shanghai'd because all these ships that were coming to Portland, the furthest port they were going to go to was the port of Shanghai. In 1871, 21 years after it started, the practice started in Portland, it entered the dictionary. 1871. We look at Portland, Oregon as a nice little Victorian city snuggled along the banks of the Willamette River, and nice and prim and proper, when reality was that it was not that way at all. That was a facade. Portland was really a place of vice, a place of human abuse, particularly when it came to Shanghai. And the Portland Underground Project involves unveiling the Shanghai Tunnels and all that it encompassed.
So Shanghai'd actually took place here in Portland? A lot of people never knew that.
Yes, correctly. In fact, I don't care where you go, it affected every single place in the Northwest.
What you're going to see tonight, some people do not want you to see. They don't want you to know this history. It's the past that they don't want revealed. When you walk through these doors, you walk into another world. Shanghai began in 1850. All up and down the West Coast, they called it crimping, except here in Portland. Portland was the jumping off place to the Orient. This is where the ships were coming, and one of the main reasons is that Portland was a freshwater port. When they entered the Columbia River from the Pacific, there were barnacles on the bottom of the ships. By the time they reached Portland, those barnacles had fallen off, and it was like they had taken that ship and put it in a dry dock. And they hired a crew to slowly scrape the bottom clean. Immediately it put money into the shipping company's pocket. But the problem was the Shanghai. When the captain arrived, there was a man who greeted him at the wharf. And he was a very polite man, very confident. And he would say something like this: "Greetings, I am the law of Portland. And I want to make sure that you have a great stay in our city. I'm going to make sure that no one is Shanghai'd from your ship. And that's going to cost you X amount of dollars." Well, the captains would say, "I'm not paying you a thing." And the Shanghaier, always polite, would say something like, "Well, good day. I know we'll be doing business later on." And then one by one, his crew would begin to vanish. The captain would go to the police, and the police would say, "Oh, that doesn't happen in our city." They'd go to City Hall, and they'd say, "No, this man is a pillar of our community. Would never do anything to harm you and your crew." The captains could do nothing. When he was ready to leave port, the Shanghai would get a hold of him and say, "I've got X amount of your men, and it's going to cost you $50 a piece to get them back. And the captain would reluctantly pay the $50 per man. And Shanghaiers loved to locate their operation in places like saloons that were very wild and a lot of fights. Because the loser was thrown outside into the street. And there was a crew that worked the alley between the two buildings. They would run out into the street and drag the loser into the alleyway, then into the building and down into the underground where they locked them up in cells like this one here. This was the best place to be locked up in because these, at least you had ventilation through the bars. Most of the cells were not made out of brick. They didn't have barred windows. They were made out of oak boards covered with tin, and they were like ovens. And people were crammed into these, and they sometimes died because of suffocation. Now, women were never Shanghai'd. Women worked for the Shanghaiers. And if you notice over here, the beautiful Victorian baby buggy, the rocking horse and the high chair, they came from the house of prostitution above us on the 3rd floor. This is when babies were born, which sometimes happened, they were raised on that 3rd floor. And the mother was always hoping that she would meet some rich person who would rescue her child and her from this way of life. But it generally didn't happen. White slavery was big in Portland. Women were thrown into white slavery, and that's where they died. But they were the bait. After you collected your men, you would approach the sea captains and let them know that you had men for sale. And the captains always purchased. And they would send word to the Shanghaier, deliver the men just before I set sail. And when they got the word, the Shanghaiers would slip knockout drops into their food or their water. Remember, they're being held in cells like this one. They would then take them through the underground, unconscious, to the ships, where they collected their $50 per head. The men had to be knocked out for 13 to 16 hours, because that's how long it took for the ship to go down the Columbia and cross the bar into the Pacific. If they came to before they crossed the bar, the men would jump overboard and try to swim the shore. Most of the people never made it. Most of the people would jump overboard and never reach shore. They would die trying to get away from the Shanghaiers because they knew what was going on. They knew that for the next 6 years, that's 2 voyages, that's how long it was going to take them to get back to Portland. For 6 years, they were literally dead. They had no control over their life. Their life was somebody else's. And if you can imagine this, take away 6 years of your life. Now, this tunnel here, if you've ever eaten at Coot Street Fish House, goes right across the street. This was blocked in 1941 by the city. And this Coot Street Fish House was a very luxurious place today. But back in its early day, it was notorious. And it was one of those Shanghai places that you did not want to go into. Now, when were the tunnels built? At the time the buildings were built. They were not built after the fact. The city, what they said about the tunnels is that they were used to deliver goods directly from the waterfront into the underground buildings. That kept it from going above ground and then down. They also said it was an ideal way to protect it against floods, because the floodwaters of the Willamette would go under the city instead of over it. And of course, there was a lot more floodwater than there were tunnels. The real reason, it was for Shanghaiing. There was plenty of victims. These victims were considered the dregs of society. The sailors, the loggers, the sheep herders, the cowboys, people that worked along the river, the people that worked as hard as they played. These were the victims, and no one cared about it. Now, if you look at the architecture, this is outstanding work. And the beautiful stonework was done by Italian stonemasons that came from Italy. They were assisted by the Chinese. The Chinese, however, I'd say are the greatest tunnel builders in the world. They were brought here by Tongs to America, and to pay for their passage, they did some very, very difficult work. They built the railroads, the canals, they cleared land, they took out stumps, and they built the underground. If you were in the old South End, the old South End is where the Morrison Street Bridge is today. On the west side of the river, there was a place called the Snug Harbor Saloon. 2 men got off a ship, and they hadn't had a drink for 3 months. And they headed right for the Snug Harbor Saloon. They started to walk through the door, and one of the men saw a trap door open in the sidewalk. So he looked down at the base of the ladder. There was a barrel of whiskey. So he told his buddy, "Come on, let's go. We got free whiskey." They climbed down to the end of the ladder. Lo and behold, there wasn't 1 barrel, there were 10 barrels. They realized they couldn't drink 10 barrels of whiskey by themselves. So not to be greedy, every person walking by, they told them to come on down and have a drink. Pretty soon there's over 30 people in the underground getting drunk. A short time later, Joseph Buncle Kelly, one of the more colorful Shanghaiers in Portland, walked by, looked down the trap door, and he saw all these passed out men. Not one to let a good opportunity pass him by. He scurried down that ladder and he counted 35 men. When he got to the last one, he realized something was terribly wrong here. No one was breathing. They were all dead. And they understood what happened. They were not in the underground of the Snug Harbor. They were in the underground of the mortuary next door. They had been drinking formaldehyde. Well, like I said, not one to let a good opportunity pass him by. He climbed up that ladder, shut that trap door, came back later that night with a crew, and they hauled every single man down to the waterfront, sold them not for the $50 a head, but $55 a head, getting the extra money from the captains, claiming it took them just a little bit more money to get them this dead drunk. How can you sell dead men? It happened all the time. The Victorian era is when Shanghai became an art form here in Portland. They perfected it. They invented things. But the biggest problem was people dying. Those knockout drops were so powerful. Remember, they had to be knocked out for 13 to 16 hours. So a man named Doc Baker, who ran the Baker Drug Company, decided if he couldn't stop Shanghai, which he hated, if he couldn't stop it, he was at least going to make sure people didn't die. And so he invented 3 different types of knockout drops. There was a small pill, a medium-sized pill, and a large pill. And these were, predominant ingredient was opium. And so the small pill was given to a small person, medium-sized pill to the medium-sized person, and a large pill to the large person. Something that even the stupidest Shanghaier could figure out. And it worked. The death rate went down to practically nothing. Where I'm standing is where 2 cells were. They were here up until 1974 when Old Town Pizza opened. Just before they opened, they had an inspection by the fire marshal, and he said, tear them down. And they said, why? They're brick. They said, tear them down, or you don't open. First of all, we're not under Old Town Pizza. Had nothing to do with them. But since this was connected to their underground, they had to tear them down. Every opportunity to block, to tear down, to erase, to hide, they did. It was a deliberate effort to erase the past. Now, I had a good old friend named Big Ears Kelly. That was his nickname. His real name was Melbourne Gibson. And he would track down people who had been Shanghai'd and people who knew about Shanghai, and I'd interview them. And he called me one day and he says, you need to get down under this one building. There is a pile of logger cork boots. Now, cork boots are spike boots that loggers used to walk on slippery logs in the woods. And I said, Kelly, when did you last see these? He says, I've never seen them. But exactly to where he said, look, I found the cork boots. Now, if you can imagine, people were wearing these. People who were being Shanghai'd. And that was really the first evidence I had that made this really human. This whole story about Shanghai and the tunnels, the underground, the vice, the corruption, this really made it human. And it changed my perspective. This was a story that needed to be told. This was a story that you couldn't hide. Because if you hid it, it was bound to happen again. And this is the place right here where more cries and more pleas for help and moaning has come from any other area. It's right here where these shoes are. Every time they investigate, there's no one here. Well, the thing is, when you were Shanghai'd and put aboard ship, it didn't just mean you're going to be back in 6 years. You may never come back. Life on ship was tough. There was dangers of the sea. But the biggest danger was this: your status on that ship. You were the low person on the totem pole, which meant when they ran out of food, you were the first one eaten. If there were more than one person who was Shanghai'd, they drew straws who was eaten first. Cannibalism aboard the ships was very common. If you look right over here to this wall, we're now working on the other side of that. And we have found remnants of an opium den, of a speakeasy, and a speakeasy was when Prohibition hit, they went underground. A lot of the bars and stuff. Some of them were really nice and others were not very nice at all. Now the problem was when you had your gambling den and your speakeasy located underground, as well as your opium den, some people wandered the wrong way. And they were never found again. They were grabbed by the Shanghaiers. It was a time that the only people that were underground were the Shanghaiers and their victims. Nobody else was down here. Nobody else was crazy enough to be down here. Up till 1941, this was all open. Nobody was worried about somebody breaking into their building and steal from them. And that all changed. Now, in 1898, the Portland Chamber of Commerce finally convinced its members that they had to do a study on Shanghai. And they found that 1,500 people a year would be in Shanghai out of Portland. Well, that's a very conservative estimate. It was actually more like 3,000. Well, let's just go with their 1,500 figure. How can 1,500 people disappear and no one see it or be in a position to stop it? Well, it was very simple. The key was the saloons. The saloons back in those days were very unique. People would claim, okay, they would go in with their buddy. One would park themselves by the front door of the saloon and not budge. He would nurse one beer all night long. The other guy would go in and have a ball. And the stories was always the same. They vanished. The guy said, I never left my post at the front door. But he disappeared. That's because he was standing at the wrong place at the right time. That bartender would pull a lever. Later on, when electricity came from Willamette Falls to Portland, here's an example of that early day electricity, they would push an electric button. They would fall through the floor, land on a mattress. The objective was not to hurt them. The objective was remove them from the world above and getting them into the underground as fast as possible. Now you're saying, okay, when they hit the mattress, this door would spring back shut. It was on a counterweight system. No one saw a thing. Now you're saying, how can somebody fall through the floor of a saloon and no one notice? Simple, because back in those days, the saloons were set up to get everyone smashed. That means the victims and the witnesses. And this is how it worked. At the base of the bar was a trough. The trough was made out of tin, brass, or tile. And between the trough and the top of the bar was a series of brass oval towel racks with towels. And the idea was this: never to let that person stop drinking. Never. And if nature called, they let them relieve themselves right there in the bar in the trough. And it worked. It worked. The victims got drunk and the witnesses got drunk. So nobody saw when they fell through that floor. So if they were standing at the wrong place at the right time, that bartender would pull that lever. When they fell through the floor, they were considered harpooned. That's the term they used, harpooned. It was like a whale. Once they're harpooned, there's no escape. The Shanghaiers had them. Once they sold them to a sea captain, they were considered shipped. These deadfalls were so efficient, Portland soared to #1 in the world for Shanghai. They used this trapdoor system also in San Francisco. They used it in Astoria, and they used it at a place that's known for its Victorian houses today, Port Townsend, Washington. But when you fell through the floor in Port Townsend, you had a boat waiting for you because you landed in the water. And Joseph Bunko Kelly, that Shanghaier, was standing on the street looking for one more victim. The brothels were empty. No one was in the saloons. Opium dens, no one. Gambling parlors, no one. The streets were deserted. Everything was vacant. And he needed one more man. So we looked across the street to Wild Man's cigar store. And there, standing outside, was a carved cigar store Indian. And he was thinking, oh my God, imagine if this was a live Native American. I could sell them, because Native Americans were highly sought after because they worked hard, they adapted to life on the ship easy, and they never complained. And they were hot property. That's who the Shanghaiers wanted. But since this guy wasn't alive, he decided to make use of him just the same. He threw a tarp over him, and him and his partner tied him up, and they hauled all 7 feet 2 inches of him to a ship. And they told the captain, this man isn't going to cost you $50. He's not going to cost you $55. But he's going to cost you $75 because you haven't seen anything so big and strong as this man. And he said, if you don't want him, we'll haul him to the captain next door and he'll buy him. Well, this captain said, I'll take him. So they hauled him down to the forecastle of the ship, and they warned this captain, don't you try to wake him up until you're well out to sea, because you will never be able to handle him if you do. The captain said he understood. After he had crossed the bar to the Pacific, he decided to get a good look at this man he had paid so much. So he went down to the bottom of the ship, and he grabbed a hold of him and began to shake him awake. And he realized, oh my God, he's stiff. He's dead, he thought. Rigor mortis had set in, so he unwrapped him, and he found this incredible cigar store Indian. And he realized that Bunko Kelly had pulled one over on him. So he tossed him overboard, and later on he floated up in a net near Astoria. The underground was an incredible system. It wasn't one little piece. It wasn't the tunnel. It was the trapdoors. It was the knockout drops. It was the vice. It was the whole combination, the corruption. That made it a real underworld. This was the unheavenly side of Portland. This was the place of darkness and shadows. There was nothing pleasant about Portland's underground. It was not a romantic story. It was a story of horrible, horrible atrocities. It was human abuse at its worst. And maybe, just maybe, if these things that people are seeing, the shadows, the doors opening and closing, maybe, just maybe, those are spirits reminding us of this past, the past that some people still to this very day do not want told. I thank you very much.
Among Portland residents and local historians, there are some that feel the tunnels were never used for any malicious activity, but rather used for transporting merchandise between buildings and even utilized during Prohibition to conceal the possession of alcohol, or perhaps even protect the city from floodwaters. However, this is a history that was never recorded in writing. This is a history told only by the scattered remains of a hidden past and the tales of a few fortunate souls who survived the experience and were brave enough to step forward and share their stories. New evidence is constantly being unearthed, and through the tours of the Shanghai Tunnels, the shadows of darkness are being brought to light. Whether written or unwritten, history never forgets.